the Black Death, the Plague, the Apocalypse. This 14th century event was the deadliest known pandemic in human history, and it also led to one of the most senseless massacres of all time. No, I'm not talking about the tens to possibly hundreds of millions of dead people. And I'm not talking about the ethnic cleansings that occurred against Jews and Gypsies, who were of course blamed for the whole thing. No, in this video, we'll talk about the hundreds of thousands of cats that were murdered and how this mistake changed the world forever. Hi, my name is Sebastian, and this is the first episode of Mistakes That Changed the World. First, some context. There's already a video I put out explaining the Black Death, so please go and have a look at that. But here's the gist of it. This bubonic plague pandemic reached Europe through Crimea, Constantinople, and Italy in 1346. From there, it spread throughout the continent and killed somewhere between 75 to 200 million people. Yeah, this was one violent outbreak, so it's no wonder that people thought this was the end of the world. So, it's only natural that in such horrible times there was a state of general panic. And it took a simple rumor to make things worse. A lot worse, actually. Killing some 200,000 domestic cats in the middle of the pandemic, an act that was, by the way, encouraged primarily by the Catholic Church, caused an almost unimaginable explosion of plague-infested rodent populations throughout the continent. You see, rats were the carriers of the bubonic plague, which they transmitted to humans through infected fleas. Sanitary conditions in urban Europe were appalling anyway, so rats had every chance to spread forth. Now, before we go and blame the people of those times for making all the wrong decisions, do remember that this happened way before germ theory. For thousands of years, people thought the main way disease spread was through bad odors, called miasma. And to top it all off, the bubonic plague was the kind of disease that would scare the bejesus out of you. This was, by the way, the most common infectious disease during those years, but it wasn't the only type of plague that was going around. This horrible affliction, caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, was characterized by the appearance of black spots on the chest and a few bumps in the groin and armpit areas that initially were pink, then purple. These are the buboes, or inflamed lymph nodes, and eventually they turned black, hence the name Black Death, and then they suppurated or leaked, and then they bled. In some places, 4 out of every 5 infected people died within 8 days, tops. But as I said, this wasn't the only type of plague that was circulating. Oh no, there was also the pneumonic variety. That one infected the lungs, and then you suffocated in your own blood. The mortality rate in this case was 95% or above, and it acted fast. The Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio painted an accurate picture. Victims of the pneumonic plague often had lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors. So, this was the atmosphere in plague-infested Europe, and it's no wonder that any rumor caused instant panic. Jews, Gypsies, and many other minorities were blamed for bringing this curse upon towns and cities, and many were executed, often in horrible ways. So, where do cats fit into this picture? Well, 100 years earlier, Pope Gregory IX described these animals as devilish creatures. He believed that cats carried Satan's spirit around and therefore were not to be trusted. This led to the superstition that black cats are unlucky. And those loyal to the Pope and Church carried out a mass extermination against them, thus laying the groundwork of the next great feline murders. However, of course, these fluffy little creatures had not always been considered devilish. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, thought the opposite of this. They developed very elaborate ways to store large quantities of grains and other foods which actually sustained their civilization. But all the food also attracted lots of rodents that could compromise much of the harvest. And that would have meant famine, death, and all that fun stuff. So very early on, the Egyptians learned that cats were natural predators of these rodents and could be used to protect food stores. Eventually, these cats moved into Egyptian homes and became revered deities. While sacrificing cats for religious purposes was a common thing, killing them without reason was a very serious offense in Egypt, punishable by death. Through the Egyptians, the Romans had become acquainted with cats and were in fact the first Europeans to adopt them as pets, with the additional and welcomed bonus as pest control. However, times change, and at the beginning of the 13th century, cats were beginning to be viewed with suspicion. Cats are independent and distant in nature, and they're quite ferocious little creatures, and in medieval Europe, that made them kind of a nuisance. The ancient Egyptians revered them. The Romans welcomed them into their homes, but both civilizations were deeply pagan. And the Catholic Church was determined to eliminate all heretics and pagans from Europe. Pope Gregory IX was the first who initiated it all. He and his church were focused on eliminating the Cathars or Albigensians. They were Christian Gnostics, considered heretics, who were accused of Satanism, among other things. It was said that during their satanic masses, the devil took the form of a black cat, and that Satan himself asked the Cathars to kiss the buttocks of the black cat during the mass. This period of religious persecution coincided with the spread of another myth, the familiar spirit. A familiar was a supernatural being that could take various forms, usually an animal, given by Satan to his witches and followers to help them carry out devilish acts. And cats were often considered a common familiar. In fact, manuscripts of the time often mention that owning a cat is an indisputable evidence that the owner was actually a witch. It was during this period that a crusade against heretics was beginning to take shape in Europe, and the Inquisition was beginning to make a name for itself. So, in response to the devilish acts of the Cathars, Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull, the Vox in Rama, the first papal document to link cats with satanic worship, ancient Egyptian cults, and witchcraft. Thus, cats, especially black ones, became evil and were horribly persecuted. Cat burning became quite popular, as well as beating and torturing them. I know, it sounds awful, and it was, but many people actually believe that those creatures literally bore the spirit of the devil. And there were of course those who were afraid, not just of the devil, but of being accused of witchcraft and Satanism. So those people too killed or chased away their cats. Some members of the European aristocracy, though, were less vulnerable to such superstitions and kept their cats precisely for their ability to keep rodent populations under control. Of course, they had no idea that rats were carriers of various diseases, but their presence in upper-class homes did prevent some illnesses in those families. Unfortunately, this was seen by many as further proof of unholiness. The idea that the devil offered witches the power to seek revenge for any perceived threat was quite popular. It was believed that the vengeance of a witch could destroy entire areas. This made them and their families a source of great fear. So, when the Black Death began, almost 100 years later, such beliefs were now entrenched in the minds of commoners. And when things took for the worse, and they did, the blame was placed on witches and their cats. Up until these centuries, witches and witchcrafts were dismissed by both the church and the people as hogwash, and the persecution or killing of people for being accused of witchcraft was even punishable by death. Well, that certainly changed. Between the 1300s and the 1700s, the persecution of witches reached its highest levels. And surprise, surprise, this coincided with consecutive waves of the plague that hit the continent after the Black Death. The Black Death was of course the most devastating epidemic of them all. Not only did it decimate the population, but it was also a catalyst for the monumental social and economic changes that rattled Europe. Especially in Western Europe, feudal lords began to compete for the labor of peasants to work their lands. Why? Because there weren't many of them left alive. And this meant higher compensation or even much higher degrees of freedoms and rights. A change in mentality also occurred. When the peasants began to demand even higher wages and the lords refused, rebellions broke out. England, Italy, Belgium, and France began to experience uprisings. It is now a commonly accepted theory that the seeds of capitalism were also planted during this period. The epidemic also changed the Catholic Church. So many believers prayed and prayed for deliverance from this disease, followed the rules and, among other things, killed their cats. And yet, their prayers went unanswered. And so the power of the church began to decline, and a new age of philosophical questioning emerged. Such transformations were so profound that they marked the birth of a new era, one of contemplation and focus on arts, music, literature, and science. The Renaissance began. This pandemic had enormous social, economic, and religious consequences, and we do live today in a world that emerged as a result of those changes. Obviously, it's really hard to precisely calculate the impact the mass murder of cats had during the plague years. In fact, we can certainly say that even with a complete feline population, the plague would have still spread to Europe. But rats and their fleas were the primary vector of the disease. And yes, fleas do infest other animals too, including cats, but rodents reproduce at an incomparably higher rate than cats, dogs, or humans. So like it or not, the immense number of deaths could have probably been lower if it weren't for the church's ideas of heresy and the spread of irrational fears. We'll never know for sure how much of an impact cats had on the Black Death, but in a world of superstition, miasmas, no sewers, no germ theory, and no penicillin, cats were the first line of defense. On the other hand, without such devastation, the Middle Ages might have lasted a lot longer. Now, all of this happened some 700 years ago, and yet some of these superstitions still persist. Nonsensical ideas such as the black cat crossing your path, bringing bad luck, or cats being a danger to newborns, or cats are familiars of witches in disguise, are still believed by millions actually, and not just in Europe but around the world. Hopefully, now you understand how and why such beliefs arose, and for crying out loud, if you see a cat on the street, just pet it, you'll be fine. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.